Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116. This is for Class 4 Monday, the 29th of April, where we are talking about poetry. And as you can see in the notes below, your paper number 2, which is going to be on drama, will be due this upcoming Wednesday. Though you've got up until the final examination in which you can hand that in. And the final, believe it or not, is on the 8th of May, which is also a Wednesday. And what I will be doing is I will be posting the final exam at 8:30 in the morning, the time that we would normally be meeting. And then it will be due 24 hours later, 8:30 on the 9th, 8:30 a.m. that is. If we were taking the class in person, you would have the class period, approximately 2 hours to take the final exam. Obviously, we're not doing this in an in-person format. We're doing it in an online format. So you have 24 hours in which to take the exam. But again, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours on this exam. You should spend approximately 2 hours or so on the examination. And it will be an essay exam that is mostly devoted to poetry, 80 points. So what I will do is give you a series of questions and ask you to choose within that. It'll be open book, open note, so that you can reference previous materials. And I understand that whatever you do in the final won't be as well written or developed as what you might do at home if you were writing a paper over a series of weeks, but you should still have an introduction, a body, a conclusion, and you should be able to synthesize some of the major elements that we've been talking about in relation to poetry. That leaves an additional 20 points, 10 points for the short story section, and 10 points for the drama section, shorter essay questions. And keep in mind that there is a film component to this class, so you will have the option on writing about film if you don't necessarily feel like you want to write about text. But again, you don't know what the questions are, so the best way to prepare is to basically have read everything, watched everything, and certainly in terms of the class discussion forums, I think you'll find some good information in there as well that you might want to utilize from your peers. And all of that is a possibility in terms of the way that you could go about proceeding with the final examination. And in terms of today's discussion, I wanted to briefly discuss poetry because I'm well aware you're probably in the midst of writing a paper. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And you can see that I've included links to these poems as well as the page numbers in which they can be found in the edition of the text which I ordered for our class. And shall I compare thee to a summer's day as a Shakespearean sonnet? So this is where I wanted to begin with our poetry section. Not to say that there wasn't poetry written before this. Of course there was. But we talked about sonnets at the very beginning of the semester when we were talking about a sorrowful woman contemplating writing a sonnet. And she realized that she didn't have to write a sonnet. And the way that that was so significant in the story is that the sonnet is one of the strictest forms of poetry writing and has very specific rules. And of course, we know in The Sorrowful Woman, or A Sorrowful Woman, that she was rebelling against the rules of wife and mother, and that was symbolized through her questioning whether or not she had to follow the rules for writing a sonnet. And of course, we know she wasn't successful ultimately in the end. So let's talk a little bit more about what a sonnet is. There are different kinds of sonnets, but usually when people talk about sonnets, they mean a Shakespearean sonnet. And this is a 14-line poem. So if you go through Shakespeare sonnets, you'll be able to count and find 14 lines. That has a specific rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern. And if you'll remember, the way that we determine that is looking at the last word of each line. And we identify the first rhyme with the first letter of the alphabet, which is A. And then when we get to a second rhyme, we identify that through the second letter of the alphabet, B, and so on and so forth. So the rhyme scheme for a Shakespearean sonnet is AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. Now, those last two lines, they rhyme together. When two lines rhyme together, that's known as a couplet. So you can think of as a couple and two. There also is a specific beat or meter to it. It's iambic pentameter, which means it is a 10-syllable line of stressed and unstressed syllables. So if you were to go through each line, you should be able to find 10 syllables. So take perhaps what is Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And if we were to go through and identify the syllables, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? 10. And you'll see that with all of the lines. So keeping to all of these parameters, 14 lines that are an A B A B C D C D E F E F G G rhyme scheme with a 10-syllable line, and also it has to discuss a subject that would be considered lofty or something that would be considered worth devoting a poem to. So it couldn't be something that was ordinary or mundane. It had to be a much greater topic than that, like love or death. And you can see that basically it's not easy to write a sonnet, and Shakespeare did this over 100 times. And we think that most of Shakespearean sonnets were written during times of plague. And as you know, the theater houses were shut down, sometimes for months at a time, when plague would ravage the community, the fear being that plague was airborne and that it could be spread through large gatherings. And Shakespeare probably devoted a good amount of time during those shutdowns. We ourselves experienced a shutdown not too long ago by writing his very famous sonnets. And in terms of the sonnets, there are as many questions about the sonnets as there are about anything else with Shakespeare's life and Shakespeare's history, including who the sonnets may have been written to. Scholars have divided up the sonnets into two major groups, the early set of sonnets and the later set of sonnets, not too perhaps inspiring, these divisions, but nevertheless, and it's thought that the early set of sonnets are probably written mostly to one person, a male. The Earl of Southampton has been speculated as the possible subject. Basically, Shakespeare's patron, somebody that he wanted to flatter, because his patron would have been supporting him politically and perhaps financially as well. And that the later set of sonnets are written to yet another person, someone known as the Dark Lady, because of her dark features. And this would be dark hair and dark eyes, not necessarily dark skin. You can think of Hermia, for instance, in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the speculation is, what kind of relationship could Shakespeare have had with this dark lady? Perhaps he was infatuated with her. That's one end of the spectrum. Perhaps he was having an active affair with her. That's the other end of the spectrum. And again, lots of conjecture, but no one really knows. So, in terms of Shakespearean sonnets, none of them are titled. So we refer to the sonnet either by its first line, or we refer to the number. And again, scholars have spent some time trying to number them in chronological order. The sonnets stand as independent units, so they're not a sonnet cycle. A sonnet cycle would be all of the sonnets fitting together to tell one long story. This is what was common at the time. And these sonnets stand as independent units, though you can see themes that run throughout the sonnets if you were to read all of the sonnets. And the sonnet that I asked you to read, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, is probably Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, and also probably the most misinterpreted sonnet. When Shakespeare decides to compare someone to a summer's day, and the idea behind a summer's day is that it's supposed to represent the epitome of perfection and beauty. We had talked a little bit about this in terms of symbolism earlier on in the semester. And then the rest of the sonnet goes through and it begins to talk about some of the negative qualities associated with the summer. That the summer is intemperate. In other words, it's unpredictable, that it can be cloudy, it can experience inclement weather, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. The darling buds of May, and we're on the cusp right now of May, is basically the early blooms of flowers that can be destroyed because of wind. And after the sonnet goes through all of the negatives that could be associated with summer, sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines. And again, the eye of heaven being the sun, you might wonder why didn't he just say sun? Not only is the eye of heaven more poetic, but also it would have to keep to the rhyme structure and to the meter structure of the poem itself. So after we go through all of this, the idea of the sonnet is that the subject of the sonnet shall live eternally. Now, nothing lives eternally. And it was one of the complaints of the summer that it hath all too short a date, and that we lease the summer. In other words, we don't own it. It's something that's in our possession, but just for a distinct period of time. So the last two lines of a sonnet, the couplet, basically serve as a kind of summary of what the argument is. It's almost like a concluding paragraph, if you will. And basically, the last two lines of the sonnet is saying that as long as eyes can see, and of course we're still seeing, in other words, as long as there are individuals left to read the sonnet itself, so long lives this being in reference to the sonnet, and this gives life to thee. In other words, the possibility of immortalizing through verse. It might be a little bit difficult to understand the last line, as long lives this, because we aren't told what the pronoun this is replacing, which noun it's replacing. So in your papers, if you had me circle something saying something like unclear pronoun reference, this would be concrete. I was referencing the idea that you used pronoun in your sentence, but that sentence doesn't give the noun. So it's unclear, even though a previous sentence might have given the noun, but each sentence should stand alone as an independent unit. Of course, if we were to add the nouns, so long lives this poem, or so long lives this sonnet, and this sonnet gives life to thee, that would mess up the rhyme scheme, of course. But basically, the idea is that writing can immortalize an individual, which gives incredible power to the poet, a godlike power to immortalize. And Shakespeare was anything but humble. So certainly we see that embedded in the sonnet, that poets have the ability to immortalize, and Shakespeare in particular has the ability to immortalize. And in theory, only God should have the ability to immortalize. And gosh darn it, Shakespeare was right, because we're still talking about this person all of these centuries later. The perhaps surprising thing about the sonnet is that it is listed in the early set of sonnets written to what scholars believe is a young man. And if you read the sonnet carefully, you'll notice that there are never any clear indicators about the gender of the person this sonnet is being written to. I think that's brilliant, because it means that the sonnet can be applicable to a lot of different situations. But that said, the way the sonnet is misread is that many people see it as a love sonnet, where Shakespeare is talking about the beauty of a woman and how she will live forever. And if you get nothing else out of this discussion, know that the sonnet is thought to have been written to a young man, not to a woman. And of course, that's led to speculation. If it's written to a man, are there homoerotic tendencies in the sonnet? If you read the sonnet carefully, you'll see that it really has nothing to do with sex. It has to do with flattery. And it makes sense to want to flatter one's patron or one's political or financial supporter. So anybody who wants to read this from a sexual perspective really isn't going to get much. Trust me, there are sonnets that are quite bawdy and quite sexual, and this isn't one of them. So again, this is more sonnet of flattery, thought to have been written to Shakespeare's patron. And that is the poem that I chose to represent the 1600s. And now for the 1700s, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Romantic poets. This gets us back to Dead Poets Society, where they oftentimes highlighted the Romantic poets. And the Romantics were a series of poets who were not necessarily writing about romance per se, but instead they were talking about nature and the natural world, the beauty of the natural world, and that how that could reflect humans and how humans can reflect the natural world. And notice that when we saw Dead Poets Society, all those beautiful outdoor scenes, awe-inspiring. And that's one of the things that the Romantic poets would oftentimes do, is talk about the beauty of nature and its ability to inspire awe. One of the famous Romantic poets was William Blake. So that was the poet that I had assigned for us to read. And again, you can find that on the link that I've included. I don't have a page number for that because it was not included in the most recent edition of or the edition that I ordered, I should say, of the text for us. But it is included in the link below. It's what's listed as handout in your course outline. And one of the reasons why I like to give the sick rose, first of all, it's very short, as you can see, and it's very simple. My suspicion is that you understand all of the words in there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the poem itself. And it says, "Oh, rose, thou art sick, and the invisible worm that flies in the night and the howling storm." And one of the reasons why I like this poem at this point in the semester is because we've come to the point in the semester where probably you as a reader are suspicious that whatever it is you read can't be literal. It's got to be symbolic. It can't be what it says. Might I suggest that a reading can be literal, but it can also be symbolic? So this poem, The Sick Rose, could indeed be about a rose who's sick. In other words, have been attacked by some sort of an insect, an invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy. We're talking about a rose bed, and if it's crimson, which is red, then these are probably red roses. And does thy secret life destroy? The idea is that if you think about the food chain, one life exists because of the consumption of another. And the poem can be read as literally as that. But the greatness of this poem is that it can also be read symbolically. And it's general enough so that it can apply to a lot of possibilities. The sick rose could represent a woman. And we talked about this with the rose for Emily. Oh, rose, thou art sick. So the woman is sick. It could be a literal sickness or it could be a figurative sickness. We know that worms oftentimes are representative of phallic symbols, so it could be in relation to sex, perhaps an illicit relationship, perhaps the loss of virginity, which might explain the crimson red, the loss of blood that would occur during the loss of virginity. Found out thy bed, and that's a literal bed, which is oftentimes where sexual relations occur, and destroyed thy life, reputation, if nothing else, would have been destroyed. But it can also be symbolic of Rose could be a societal ill, or Rose could be experiencing a societal ill. Thou art ill with the invisible worm that flies in the night. It could be something like plague or tuberculosis or another disease, but it could also be the corruption of society. And I would suggest that this poem lends itself to all of these readings and more. That's one of the things about the Romantic period is that it really is general enough to allow you to plug in lots of possibilities, which is something that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. But I think at this point, you basically are at the you're at the assumption that a reading can't mean what it says, and I would say that a sick rose is exactly what it says, but it also is so much more. And then the last poem that I wanted to talk about is, and this is for our 1800s, so I just selected a poem, and you'll see that I selected several poems from the 1900s when we're getting a little closer to the 1900s, because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. And I've included a page number, and I've also included the link. Now, Emily Dickinson is or was local from Amherst, Massachusetts. One of the reasons why Emily Dickinson is so important. And in fact, if you look at the notes below, you'll see that I've included a link to the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, as well as a documentary that talks a little bit about her life, a biography, and some of her writing. It's 57 minutes long, so I don't necessarily expect you to see it, but I encourage you to see it. I think it's fascinating learning about her life, and also it highlights much of her poetry. So my hope is that at the ending of this video is that you'll see it. But again, I'm quite aware that you are also working on a paper. And Emily Dickinson comes with this aura about her where individuals aren't very sure about how to classify her because her life was so unusual. She basically lived as a recluse. She attended Mount Holyoke College, and then after that, basically stayed in her father's bedroom. Her father being a wealthy attorney in Amherst, so she had the privilege and the opportunity to do such a thing. She never married, which is what was expected of someone of her class, and she never had children. And basically, she devoted her life to writing, and almost an experience that it might be somewhat similar to A Sorrowful Woman, as unusual a sorrowful woman might have appeared by isolating herself from her family. There are many stories of Emily Dickinson isolating herself from friends, and she did have friends, even though she, I guess, in modern terms, would be called agoraphobic, afraid to go outside. But we think about how today people are able to maintain relationships through social media. During Emily Dickinson's time, the way people maintained relationships was through letter writing. And there's this wonderful story where she was asked to a party. Someone came to her home, and of course, she didn't leave her bedroom. She hid behind a curtain and in her upstairs bedroom next to a window. And what she did was she opened the window and she lowered a rope that had a basket attached to it. In the basket were some baked goods with the note saying, "I can't attend your social function, I'm sorry, but please accept these baked goods in my absence." So again, very unusual, her behavior for the time period, especially for a woman of a particular position. She very outwardly claimed that she disliked housework. She outwardly claimed that she didn't believe in organized religion, and in fact refused to go to church after a while, which would have been very noticeable for someone of her class at that time period. Church was a place to be seen, and her poetry was written privately. So it was for her eyes only, but it was only after her death that her sister found her poems. They were all, Emily Dickinson wrote over 1,000 poems, and they were all bound together in packets, and her sister and an editor published some of them. But what they did, and it really is a crime, is that they changed the poetry to make it grammatically correct. If you know anything about poetry, you don't do that. Basically, Emily Dickinson was very fond of using the dash. The dash would oftentimes substitute for something like a comma. And Emily Dickinson was also fond of irregular capitalization. So she wasn't necessarily following the rules of grammar, which I think is brilliant because she wasn't following the rules of society either. So this was a way that she was able to rebel. Honestly, the poetry that was published upon her death didn't really excite a lot of interest. It was only until years later when an editor published her poetry in the way that it was intended to be read in the original, with all of the dashes and all of the irregular capitalization, that the poetry really became interesting to scholars. There was a rawness to it, a jaggedness to it. And you want to be careful when you're reading Emily Dickinson's poetry to make sure that you are reading her original version, not the corrected version. And the easy way to do this is by looking at the poem and seeing if there are dashes at the endings of the lines. If there are, then you're reading the correct Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson, too, did not title her poems, so we refer to Emily Dickinson's poetry by the first line. So it's very similar to a Shakespearean sonnet. And Emily Dickinson tends to be difficult to read. She talks about these extreme emotional states. It's not easy to indicate a emotion in language. I think Emily Dickinson does it quite well. But I think that's one of the challenges of her poetry, and that oftentimes even the scholars themselves say that they struggle with understanding her poetry because it's quite personal. Again, she was writing for herself. That said, her poetry is also quite universal in that it talks about the universal human condition. And In terms of her poetry, I've often suggested rather than trying to understand it in its entirety, to instead just pick out a few lines. So, a line such as I dwell on possibility, which is a line that oftentimes is cited at graduations, and appropriately so, because that's what basically students do. They dwell in possibility. But think about all of the possibilities of dwell, as in obsessing over or thinking about or living in, and all of those possibilities are applicable to that just one line. So, one of the things about Emily Dickinson is that her poetry can be rather dark. She oftentimes writes about death. And that said, she writes about death in a positive way. And she writes from the perspective of death, as if she understands death, because she actually is writing from the perspective of somebody who's dead, which is what we get in this poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And what we get in this poem as we go through each of the stanzas, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And there's a long tradition of death being referenced as a male. We don't usually think of death as something that's kind. But in this poem, it is. The idea is that death relieves suffering and that death offers something that's greater and grander, which is the afterlife. And I just finished saying that Emily Dickinson wasn't necessarily a supporter of organized religion, yet she was quite spiritual and talked about how God was evidenced everywhere in the natural world. So this is a poem that basically proves the existence of an afterlife because she's speaking from the perspective of the afterlife. And as she talks about how death and basically took her in his carriage, there's a long literary tradition of a carriage ride being representational of the life cycle that we go through. And we see this as she's going through her carriage, what they pass, all the stages of life. Children in the ring, so that's youth, and ring would be during play. And they would oftentimes play a game called Ring Around the Rosie, which was actually about plague. So again, there's that emphasis on the idea of death. And then the fields of gazing grain. And this is adulthood. And this is the stage perhaps that we're in of work. And then setting sun. And this is, of course, old age. And then we see how we have a transition from the physical world going into the spiritual world as they begin to pass the setting sun, and that the dews drew quivering and chill. There's a transition in the weather, and she's wearing very little, only gossamer, my gown, and my tippet, which is a shawl, only tulle. And gossamer is this shimmery, very thin and fragile fabric. And so is tulle. Tulle is something that you use for things like tutus, wedding veils, things of that nature. Gossamer has more of a spiritual element to it. It's oftentimes associated with the fairy world, for instance, and gossamer wings. But the idea is that these both are very thin and insubstantial, even though it's getting cold outside. But the reality is that clothing is a human construct. As Emily is transitioning into the afterlife, she doesn't have to worry about clothing for either protection against the elements, again, that's a human construct, or for a social convention, that's also a human construct. And she talks about how she put away her labor and her leisure too. Again, human constructs. And you don't need leisure if you don't have labor. So, again, the idea that she's transitioning into a very different kind of existence. And then she discusses how since then 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day. In other words, this happened many, many years ago. So she's speaking from the perspective of afterlife. And again, time is also a human construct. So you don't have to worry about time, which is why the driver knew no haste. There isn't any concern about time in the afterlife because time is infinite. And she talks about how the horses' heads were towards eternity. And the idea of the horses' heads, the horses pulling the carriage that she's in. But this is also biblical reference. So even though she wasn't religious, she would make biblical references. If you've ever heard of the horsemen of the apocalypse. So she's making a reference to the ending of time where everybody will be in the afterlife. And that said, I think that I've learned that Emily Dickinson is sometimes an acquired taste. I didn't necessarily like her very much as an undergraduate, quite frankly, because I didn't understand her. But then as time went on, I really began to appreciate her and her ability to talk about emotional states in a way that I've really seen no other poet be able to do. So, this is just one example of her poetry. It's one of the clearer examples of her poems. Notice that it's divided up into stanzas, those sections that look like paragraphs that each are addressing a particular topic. Um, and that helps in terms of understanding the progression that goes on in this particular poem. Her poem's very personal. I could not stop for death, but yet universal because none of us can stop for death. Um, and again, the idea that death is not a negative or something to fear, but something positive and to be embraced because it brings something that's much better. So, those were the poems that I had assigned for today. So, our attendance question, which would be due Wednesday the 1st, which of the three poems shall I compare thee to a summer's day, the sick rose, or because I could not stop for death, did you like the most and why? And again, our paper will be due on Wednesday, where we will continue on with poetry. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And you'll see very soon a shift in the poetry. I try to put it in chronological order so that you could see how basically one stage helps to inform the other. It's almost like musicians, how they've been influenced by previous musicians of the past. You can certainly admire a musician without knowing how previous musicians have influenced them. But if you know their history and how they were influenced by past musicians, then their songs are much richer. And there is really a correlation between music and poetry. Poetry is very musical. It should be read out loud. It should be heard through the ear. And some of the poems that are coming up, you'll see that the links that I've included are either poems where we have professional readers reading them, or we've got the poets themselves reading them. And much like music, the idea is that a different reader or a different musician will give a different kind of interpretation. So, the idea of listening to poetry, there's an element of performance in there, much like we were talking about with drama, and with film, in a way that we might not necessarily see with, let's just say, a short story. But again, which poem did you like the best and most? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, the sick rose, and because I could not stop for death, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye bye.